So let's take a look at Japan before its transformation into an empire in the late 19th century. What we're looking at here when we're thinking about Japan before it becomes an empire, we're talking about the Tokugawa era, about 1600 to 1868, 268 years, that's a long time. And what we have here is we have a flourishing agricultural civilization that is nonetheless on the periphery and somewhat isolated from the East Asian mainland. You never want to take these tropes of isolation too far. There's always some sort of exchange going on, but generally speaking, compared to other places on the Asian continental mainland, Japan is relatively isolated. More importantly, although it is a flourishing agricultural civilization, it's very mountainous, and it's relatively resource poor from the perspective of industrial modernization that the Europeans are going to be introducing to Asia. That's going to become very important later. So what we have here is a generally resource poor, isolated island state that is going to be on the periphery of the East Asian mainland. Now what that means is that when the Europeans start to come over to East Asia and they're looking for markets to break into, they're looking for a place where they say, hey, we can siphon off the wealth of the wealthiest, most resourceful, and largest state in Asia, outside of India, that's going to be China. So Japan is going to fortunately find itself on the periphery of Europeans' interest, commercial interest in Asia. What this means is that the Europeans are focused almost entirely on exploiting what they hope is going to be a weak but unified China. Okay? The thing here is that China is much more centralized. It's been a centralized empire for almost 2,000 years by the time the European ships begin to arrive in East Asia. And if you can win a military battle against the Chinese, so this time it's the Qing Empire ruled by a Manchu court, if you can win a military battle with them, that may not be easy before the Industrial Revolution, but after the Industrial Revolution, that's going to become much easier to do. Once you win that battle, you can have sign a treaty known as the unequal treaties, and then the emperor will be able to enforce the writ of that treaty throughout anywhere that he rules. That opens up a huge market potential for the Europeans. And once they realize that, hey, we can defeat any army that is thrown our way in East Asia, they're going to start saying, hey, we can get a lot more bang for our buck in China. What's the problem with Japan? Why are the Europeans, although they're going to try to break through the Tokugawa state is has an isolated posture towards the rest of the world, trying to keep foreigners at bay, not terribly interested, although there is some low-level intercourse between them. Nevertheless, what the Europeans are going to find is that it takes a lot more effort to get a lot less rewards from going to battle against the Japanese, okay? Because the Tokugawa era is characterized by a highly decentralized state. The Japanese state has never been centralized in the way that we saw on the East Asian mainland with the emperor of various Chinese dynasties. In Japan, you've got several different major actors, political actors that you have to deal with. You have the emperor. He's basically a powerless figurehead, has been so for about 1,000 years now. He resides in Kyoto. But nevertheless, his symbolic power is still huge. No one has ever actually taken the drastic step of overthrowing the emperor. So there is sort of this technically unbroken line of emperors, mostly powerless. All right. You have the shogun, that's your military figure who has the chief military power for the Japanese islands. He doesn't want to actually call himself an emperor. He refers to himself as a military general, and his government is the bakufu, which is basically a tent camp. A tent office. He wants to emphasize that I just have a temporary military office that I set up to protect the emperor, to carry out the emperor's affairs on his behalf, when in reality, he pretty much is kind of like a de facto emperor, although technically the emperor is still symbolically alive and very much has his lack of power and his office and title and palaces and whatnot in Kyoto. The shogun is based in Edo. That's going to eventually become renamed Tokyo in our own modern day era. All right, and then you have daimyo. The outer domains are, prominent landholders is what the name literally translates to. The daimyo are all the regional warlords who submitted in 1600 to the Tokugawa shogunate. They lost the battle, and they decided, okay, we can't really defeat Edo, we can't really defeat the Tokugawa shogun, but we still retain a significant amount of autonomy. Okay, the shogun and the emperor can't just issue decrees and expect that they're going to be respected and implemented throughout all the, well more than 100 daimyo throughout Japan, throughout the Japanese islands. So when the Westerners get here, when the Europeans show up in Japan and China and they're looking, how do we get the biggest bang for our buck? Well, if we're going to project our power halfway around the world, win a military victory, where are we going to get the most for our efforts? They immediately realize, oh, China. There's one pressure point, the emperor, and when you defeat him in battle, his forces in battle, you get access, potentially, to a lot of the Chinese empire. Well, it's technically the Qing Empire at this time period. Whereas with Japan, they're realizing, even if we bring our gunboats out here at great expense and win a battle with the shogun in Edo, the shogun's forces in Edo, we realize very quickly he actually can't enforce his rule. Whatever concessions he makes to us is sort of aspirational concessions only, on paper only. If we actually want to go into the daimyo, into the outer domains, and implement the privileges that we've gained in this battle, it's actually really hard to do so. The daimyo sometimes say, no, sorry, we're not going to respect that, because they're far more autonomous than the provinces and the magistrates are in the Qing Empire on the mainland. So you do have in both instances the Europeans and the Americans. Very importantly in Japan, it's actually the Americans, Commodore Matthew Perry in the 1850s, who's going to bring his gunboats to sort of open Japan, roughly the same time, a little bit later than the Europeans are doing in China. And they're going to win these battles. They're going to force the Japanese, the shogun, to sign an unequal treaty, just like they did with the Chinese 10 years earlier. However, what you're going to find is that the Europeans are far less aggressive and really far less greedy when you think about it with Japan than they are going to be with the Qing Empire. And as a result, they're going to give Japan a lot of breathing space because they realize, hey, we won these battles, we get these unequal treaties, but it's not that profitable. We really still can't go into the great extent of the Japanese islands and enforce our privileges because the daimyo have significant amount of autonomy and they are belligerent still. They're not going to respect, well, we'll have to fight again in order to get these concessions. We don't have to do that in China. And so they start to sort of not exploit Japan and not impose so many economic indemnities after each war as they will do every single time with the Qing Empire. So I like to say the Europeans gave Japan more breathing space. They made the Japanese realize that you're going to have to modernize, you're going to have to industrialize along European lines, or you're going to be destroyed or completely lose sovereignty of your state. But nevertheless, they gave Japan just enough breathing space, which China never got, to actually undertake that modernization without constant repeated wars, new unequal treaties, and new crippling economic sanctions that the Qing Empire constantly had imposed on them for the remainder of the 19th century and heck, into the 20th century as well. Just keep Japan sort of stable. They were very afraid, actually, because it was so decentralized and so many different power holders. The Europeans were afraid if we push too hard in Japan, we'll actually destabilize and the whole house of cards will come falling down. And we won't have access to anything. It'll be anarchy. It'll be civil war. The daimyo and the shogunate will all be sort of fighting each other. We don't want that. We don't want Japan to collapse. Let's just keep it stable as a base to sort of, set up shop, create our sort of a treaty port in Yokohama, just south of Tokyo, a nice peaceful base to sort of get an introduction to Asian culture and whatnot, and use it as a base to infiltrate China more than to really exploit Japan. There's a great analogy here that one scholar has come up comparing Japan at this time period to Siam, modern day Thailand, where Siam is very proud, likes to announce, oh, we were always continuously independent, never formally colonized. Well, that's true, and that's great, congratulations, but the reasons are really things can be ascribed to factors beyond your control. It's these coincidences outside of the control of the Siamese and really outside of the control of the Japanese as well. You're sandwiched in between two empires. The French are looking at Indochina to the east, the British are in Burma and India to the west. And essentially, they say, you know what, it'll be useful for Siam to sort of be this little buffer zone between our two empires. And we can use Siam as sort of like this neutral base for other nearby targets, and also keep the French and the British away from each other. Japan is kind of similar as well. They're going to say, you know what, let's just keep Japan as sort of this neutral staging ground for our adventures on the East Asian mainland, because there's not a whole lot useful we can really get out of Japan anyways. And if we push too hard, it'll descend into civil war and anarchy, and that's not good for anyone. It's certainly not good for business. The main result over the course of the 1850s and the 1860s is that Western entry to Japan, the sort of humiliation of the shogun in Edo after losing the wars, and then he has to create a concession of a treaty port of Yokohama. White-skinned foreigners begin to live in Japan, and you start seeing them on the roads around Edo and whatnot. That's sort of a provocation to some people in Japan. Some of the daimyo are saying, hey, this is humiliating. All right, and unlike in the provinces in China where you get some magistrates saying this is humiliating as well, these daimyo can actually do something about it, and you start getting assassinations of foreigners on the highways back and forth to Edo and whatnot, new diplomatic concessions, humiliation of the Edo state, nothing like what's going on with the Qing Empire, but nevertheless, tensions are rising. And there's a debate among who can best deal with the Western impact, the Western threat to the Tokugawa state. And this eventually, by and large, in the 1860s, comes to a head when it stimulates conflict among the three major constituencies. The daimyo, the two most powerful daimyo, are going to be in the southwestern part. One is on the island of Kyushu, and the other one is on the southwestern portion of Honshu. Satsuma and Choshu. Those are the two most powerful daimyo at this time period. So you've got Satsuma and Choshu, you've got the shogun in Edo, and you have the figurehead puppet emperor who hasn't had power in 900 years, but is still a very powerful symbol. Eventually what you get is Satsuma and Choshu allying together, say, enough of this humiliation at the Western powers, we need to take matters into our own hand, and they basically undertake, engineer a coup against the shogunate, the Tokugawa shogunate in Edo, replace the shogun with their own ruler, and say, we are going to install the Japanese emperor, restore him to his rightful place. He's no longer going to have a shogun who protects him. We're going to restore him. He's going to be the preeminent power of Japan. And this is why it's known as, in 1868 as the Meiji Restoration. Meiji being the reign name of the new emperor, who is quote-unquote restored to his throne. And he will actually have much more power than any Japanese emperor has had for the past 900 years or so, and play a major role until the defeat of Japan in World War II in 1945, at which time he'll sort of be taken back to his figurehead, powerless puppet role that he once had before. But now, 1868, the conflict of the Western impact leads to a quick overthrow of the government. Oh, if only Qing China had a quick overthrow of the government and could have tried to create a new republic or something in the 19th century, would have saved everyone a whole lot of heartache. But they sort of, constantly want to keep China unified but weak so it can be exploited, so it can be bled over and over again for the benefit of the European powers. Japan gets the opportunity to overthrow the old order very quickly, fairly bloodlessly, and immediately then Satsuma and Choshu, who dominate the new Japanese state, they will basically say, you know what, we actually do need to undertake a wholesale program of westernization and modernization so that we can confront the Western powers. Ironically, because this is what they accused Tokugawa state of doing too much of, now they're going to do it themselves. The end result for us, however, is after 1868, breakneck modernization and Western reforms ensue in every single aspect of Japanese society, politics, government, culture as well, and a new centralized state that is able to fairly quickly keep the Europeans at bay, reverse the unequal treaties that it has signed, all with the tacit sort of cooperation of the Westerners who say, you know what, it's good to have Japan under one united ruler. It's going to be better for us. Look, they're westernizing. They're kind of they're going to become just like us. They're going to be our friends and whatnot. And they did not apply the constant crippling pressure and economic indemnities that were constantly imposed upon the Qing Empire throughout the latter half of the 19th century. And this will end up being a boon for the Japanese to industrialize basically unmolested in any significant way, and allow them to then win their own wars against other Asian powers and interfere on the Asian mainland, where they've usually been an afterthought, and also eventually confront Western powers as well.